Hey everybody, this week we're going to be talking about Ida B. Wells. We're going to be looking specifically at some excerpts from her work, A Red Record. Wells was born in 1862 and lived till 1931. She was a journalist and an activist, and she spent much of her life trying to awaken the national conscience to the problem of lynching. Before I begin, I should just note that Wells' work deals with racist violence in the United States, and specifically with the practice of lynching. So her work does include some graphic descriptions of racist violence. There are also some discussions of sexual assault and sexual assault allegations. So Wells' work focuses primarily on the practice of lynching. The situation is that we have innocent black people, mostly men, who are accused of crimes often that they did not commit. Sometimes they're even family members of people accused of crimes, or just another person who happened to be nearby when a crime was committed. In some cases, it's a person who's perceived to have violated a social taboo. So you have a black man in a consensual relationship with a white woman, and that's enough to set off some angry mob of white people to attack that man. These crimes were not being investigated. The perpetrators were not being brought to justice. It's an outrage. Now, I think in A Red Record, there's two parallel arguments we want to keep track of. The first argument is one that probably appeals mostly to us as modern readers, right? This is racist violence. We read these accounts and we see depictions of abhorrent, racist violence. And as people living in the 21st century, as we read this, we recoil, right? I would hope. It's repulsive to us. It's brutal and it's obviously unjust. But Wells' other argument, her second argument, has to do with the rule of law. And this one's rhetorically, I think, really interesting, so I want to spend some time on it. So Wells knows, in order to effect change, she has to persuade an unsympathetic audience. So encouraging a broadly racist population to sympathize with a minority is only going to get you so far. So Wells appeals to these principles. Note her use of language early in this work. She talks about the conscienceless outlawry of these mobs. She makes the case that even if you're inclined to believe that these people being assaulted and murdered did something wrong, which almost always they did not, then you ought to believe in the importance of just process, of trials, of accusations, of lawyers, of laws, of just penalties. What she's talking about is the rule of law. And this is quite an interesting strategy on Wells' part because she appeals to this very deep tradition of the rule of law to make her case. So one of the central theses of Wells' A Red Record is that mob violence undermines the rule of law. We cannot allow armed gangs of angry white men to be judge, jury, and executioner in these cases. The principle of mob rule is might makes right. Her appeal is, if you're someone who believes in the rule of law, then mob rule just simply cannot be allowed. What we mean when we say the rule of law is that the laws are not subordinate to the whims or inclinations of the people in charge, right? So the law is not subordinate to any official or administrator or monarch or dictator. In fact, we want our political leaders and our law enforcement officers to themselves be subordinate to the rule of law. Now, as I said, by invoking the rule of law, Wells is drawing on a very deep tradition here. One of, perhaps the founding myth in the rule of law tradition, can be traced back to Titus Livy and his early histories of Rome. And this is the story of Junius Brutus and his sons. So after Rome, with the help of Junius Brutus, overthrew the monarch and expelled the Tarquin from the city in about 509 BCE, they founded the Roman Republic. Junius Brutus was installed as one of the two consuls. However, not everyone is happy with the new republic. Specifically, some young aristocrats were happier with the tyrant because they got special treatment. So these young aristocrats began conspiring with the Tarquin to overthrow the republic and reinstall the monarch. But an enslaved person discovers the plot and reports it to Brutus. But then Brutus discovers that two of his own sons are among the conspirators. And this is the great climax of the story. Because Brutus believes so strongly in the republic and the rule of law, and because his sons had betrayed the republic and violated the law, he has them executed. It was a memorable scene, for the consular office imposed upon a father the duty of exacting the supreme penalty from his sons, so that he, who, of all men, should have been spared the sight of their suffering, was the one whom fate ordained to enforce it. The condemned criminals were bound to the stake. All were young men of the best blood in Rome, but only the consul's sons drew the eyes of the spectators. Throughout the pitiful scene, all eyes were on the father's face, where a father's anguish was plain to see. The story of Brutus and his sons is so powerful because the image there is that a father will not even show favoritism to his own children, that the law will dictate just punishment, even in this case. The story points to what's so valuable about the rule of law because we don't want the law to be set up so that like can benefit like. The other thing Wells does really effectively in this work is just dismantle the arguments that are used to justify or explain away lynching. Specifically, I want you to pay attention to how effectively Wells uses evidence to make her case. Wells says by and large there have been 3 excuses used to explain why black men are lynched with such frequency in the southern U.S. The first excuse is race riots. Often when these men are murdered, it's explained away as the result of some more general social disruption or violence, a riot. But look at the way Wells draws our attention to evidence. She says there's never any evidence that these riots are happening. And in fact, it's pretty strange that it's only ever black men who are killed as a result of this supposed general riot. No white men ever seem to suffer harm. The second excuse Wells discusses has to do with black domination at the polls. And here Wells is charting the way that lynching is used as a brutal kind of voter intimidation to prevent black people from exercising their right to vote. But Wells says this excuse essentially dries up because so effective was the voter intimidation that it no longer became plausible. Wells then spends a lot of time on the third excuse, which she finds the most repulsive. And the argument there is that white men need to stand up for the chastity and virtue of white women because black men are supposedly a threat. Pay attention as you go through to the way that Wells systematically demolishes this argument and the evidence she mounts to counter it. One example Wells gives, for example, is that this threat was apparently not a real one during the period of slavery. Wells said that during slavery, white men never seemed to mind leaving their families in the care of enslaved people. It's only once black people become emancipated that this threat suddenly emerges as a reality. So Wells' argument here, and really this is key to the whole work, is that lynching emerges as a practice in response to emancipation. As black people become increasingly free in the United States, white people respond with violence as an attempt to reassert dominance. So while the racist system of slavery may have ended, it may also have transformed into a new system of violence. It's because of this argument that I find Wells so useful and important to us, especially if we're white readers, because she's charting a dynamic whereby one system of racist violence ends and another one begins, another one emerges to take its place. And when we look at the history of the 19th and 20th, 21st centuries, we can see this dynamic repeating itself over and over again. It's important to recognize that, on the one hand, there's this story we tell ourselves about modernity, that modernity is about the progressive liberation of peoples and the world. Modernity is about the ascendance of democracy and human rights. And there's truth to that. But at the same time, there's this other history we have to attend to. And that's a history of patterns of domination, especially white supremacy. What we see, if we open our eyes, are these same dynamics of racist domination repeating themselves over and over again in different formulations. I think this is so important for us to understand. If we want to understand modernity and be honest about the modern world, we absolutely have to understand this. Thanks very much for watching, everyone. I really appreciate it.